schools, the probable cause standard ought to apply to searches of students. Our first contention is decreasing racism. Instituting probable cause will reduce racism by increasing the objectivity of searches. Law Professor Sarah Foreman writes in 2011 that if anyone and anything can be viewed as suspicious, then the exercise of discretion becomes particularly susceptible to all kinds of bias, because determining what constitutes a reasonable suspicion is based on a subjective interpretation of behavior, which allows deep-seated aversions to affect decision-making. Law Professor Jason Nance quantifies in 2015 that under reasonable suspicion, the odds of conducting searches were 7.7 times greater for schools with minority populations over 50% than for schools with minority populations between 20 and 50%. Fortunately, Foreman continues that instituting probable cause will limit the discretion of teachers and SROs as it is less subjective and based on more evidence, which would decrease the potential for bias. Professor Jack Glazer finds empirically in 2015 that when the search standard was raised for customs officials, the racial disparity in searches declined. Addressing racism in schools is crucial because Mike Gill of Disability Studies Quarterly explains in 2004 that the K-12 educational process in the U.S. helps to shape and formulate the way that future U.S. citizens will view the world around them. Racist searches create a problematic worldview in two ways. First is that discriminatory searches teach racism. Nance writes in 2013 that discrimination in searches sends the message that white students are privileged and have greater rights to privacy, and that minorities are suspect and cannot be trusted. This will breed a generation of children who will adopt and accept racist practices. Second is that victims of racist searches internalize oppression, which increases violence. Nance writes that discriminatory searches teach non-white children that they are racially inferior, and Justice Program Officer Kai-Jun Maj furthers in 2011 that schools are teaching students of color that they are dangerous criminals, which leads them to internalize these labels and begin acting in ways that reflect the negative and violent expectations that society places on them. Contention 2 is curtailing individual searches. While reasonable suspicion allows for too many unjust searches, economics professor Hugo Milon finds in 2010 that if the search standard is raised, the number of searches will decrease. Empirically, Jack Glazer finds that raising the search standard for customs officers led to a 75% reduction in searches. This has two benefits. First is that searches contribute to the school-to-prison pipeline. When students are caught with contraband, they're often pushed into the criminal justice system, as according to criminologist P.J. Hirschfield in 2000, 41 states mandate that schools report school crimes, including drug offenses, to law enforcement. Moreover, Don Lieberman of the New York Civil Liberty Union found in 2007, suspensions play a pivotal role in perpetuating the school-to-prison pipeline because students who have been suspended are 3 times more likely to drop out, and dropping out triples the likelihood that a person will be incarcerated later in life. As a result, reasonable suspicion has created an epidemic. Sarah Mins of The Atlantic reports in 2014 that the U.S. sends 2 million children to juvenile detention every year, 95% of whom have never committed a violent crime. Being sent to prison ruins the lives of students because Professor Jason Nance explains in 2015 that being incarcerated limits students' future educational and employment opportunities and drastically increases the likelihood that they go back to prison later in life. Second is that searches undermine students' trust in their schools, which leads to an increase in crime. P.J. Hirschfield writes in 2000 that personal searches seem to be one of the clearest indications of criminalization because they define students as criminal suspects. Treating students as criminals is devastating because law professor Sarah Foreman explains in 2011 that school has a profound impact on students' understanding of their relationship with the state. Unfortunately, repeated experiences with legal actors who seem to abuse their authority through searches contributes to a sense of alienation that eventually leads students towards oppositional culture that is steeped in violence, as they're more likely to join gangs for protection and rebel against the state through crime. Criminal justice professor Stephanie Wiley quantifies in 2013 that among students with similar propensities towards crime, those who were stopped committed 64% more delinquent acts in the following 6 months. For all these reasons, we agree.
Because the cure is worse than the disease, Ardrey Kell is proud to debate. Contention 1 is surveillance. According to Benjamin Tiller from St. Louis University, a probable cause standard would make it harder for schools to maintain safety and order. Due to this perceived threat of danger, Jason Nance from the University of Florida finds that school officials and policymakers resort to strict security measures, including intense surveillance practices. Unfortunately, school surveillance has numerous detrimental impacts. According to Abigail Hankin from the American School Health Association, there is insufficient data to conclude that increased surveillance reduces the risk of violent behavior among students. But rather, research suggests that surveillance detrimentally impacts the perception of safety. Jason Nance from the University of Florida continues that strict security measures sour students' attitudes, produce barriers between students and educators, students, schools' reliance on security measures were shown to increase disorder, delinquency, and crime. Our second point of contention is increasing zero tolerance. Mental Health America defines zero tolerance as school, district, or state policies that mandate predetermined punishments for specific offenses regardless of their situational context. Because of their inflexible and unforgiving nature, Christopher Mao of Cleveland State University notes that zero tolerance policies have increased the rate of arrest by 500%, often for low-level offenses. As a result, Sarah Williams of The Atlantic reports that the U.S. sends 2 million children to juvenile justice every year, 95% of whom have never committed a violent crime. Luckily, we are moving away from zero tolerance policies. As the ACS reports, 38 states have passed legislation that mitigates the effects of these policies to help students stay in school. Unfortunately, applying the probable cause standard would cause schools to switch this trend in 3 ways. First, by perpetuating media sensationalism. John Warner of the University of Missouri explains, media sensationalism about youth violence fosters a narrative of fear that creates a call for action to protect children through intense punitive measures. In a world where probable cause exists in schools, every headline is going to pander to the fears of parents by making them believe their children are less safe. Dana Bennett of Virginia State University explains why. When covering school crime, the media has historically concentrated on the focus of schools to conduct searches as they please. Thus, as searches decrease, the media increasingly calls for punitive measures. Christopher Lewis of UCLA concurs, writing that punitive sentiment is at its highest when crime is depicted as a result of a permissive justice system. And in this case, a justice system that is permissive with a higher standard is the impetus to implementing zero tolerance. Second, stifling social movements. Stephen Bosher of the University of Michigan writes, using courts as a venue for social change saps energy from more political and broad-based grassroots organizations by creating the illusion that the problem has been solved. This is corroborated by Douglas Majane of Loyola Law School, who finds that court victories often signal continued activism is no longer necessary, which ultimately ends the efforts of these movements. This hurts the movement for decriminalization, as Michael Evans of Miami University concludes. Community organizations that create discourse and political accountability are imperative to addressing the roots of these issues. Third, a reduction in deterrence. School officials see reasonable suspicion as an important deterrent to crime. Brian Payne of Georgia State University confirms this, finding that 95% of school administrators agree that the reasonable suspicion standard is an appropriate standard to search and, if anything, should be widened. Probable cause would erode this deterrence, as Northwestern University's Conscience and Code explains in 2013, as officials conduct fewer searches due to heightened standards, there's a lower perceived likelihood that crime will be resolved. Schools thus resort to zero-tolerance policies to compensate for the perceived lack of deterrence. Richard Aram of New York University finds that, ironically, the historical expansion of student legal rights, rather than enhancing youth outcomes, has increased schools' reliance on authoritarian measures. He concludes that when schools' authority over discipline is limited, they turn to these policies like zero-tolerance policies, and they are most often adopted in the place. But Sasha Coupe tells you of the University of Pennsylvania, and she even explains that in the face of an excess of research and reformative policies, perceived increases in youth criminal activity bolster support for zero tolerance. Overall, zero tolerance is a life-sowing opportunity, as Heitzig corroborates that they are the #1 facilitator of the school to prison pipeline, not surgeons. For these reasons, we urge the negative ballot.
What's the date on Quebec? I remember that we asked for it and that's what we were looking for, but I don't remember what it is.
No, just okay, no, I remember.
You remember? Yeah, I have a word. So first, just quickly on surveillance, what types of things are you talking about?
Okay, so on surveillance, we talk about a general increase in all surveillance methods.
So everything. Okay, cool. Now I'm gonna ask just like one more question on ZT. So if reasonable suspicion.
Well, I never actually
yeah,
agreed.
go.
So, how much criminalization is a result of these searches?
We can say a lot. Hirschfield says that it's one of the clearest indications of criminalization because you're taking a specific kid and saying,
Okay.
I think you.
So, are searches more common than low-level offenses? Okay, well then, if you want to make that motion, that's fine by me. Yeah, you may.
Cool. So you say that like reasonable suspicion is a deterrent to crime, right? And it's just going to cause people to be outraged.
Yeah.
Right? If zero tolerance is like in place to compensate for that, then why isn't the decrease in zero tolerance causing immediate outrage?
Actually, here's a really good comparison, right? Like your Glacier evidence even corroborates this. That when you see an increase in the evidentiary standard, there's less searches, but there's a 4 times increase in contraband, which means that more drugs and contraband are being brought into our schools. Right then and there, you see that there's already an increase in the amount of contraband on campus, right?
So
Like,
why is
that's
that
how you
any,
use
why
the
is,
deterrent.
why is that any different than zero tolerance? Why is zero tolerance for
So like zero tolerance. How is this? Can you please frame frame the question in a different light.
So, okay, so you say that like reasonable suspicion is a deterrent, and in order to compensate for the decrease in the deterrence, we put
Yes.
back a different deterrent, which is zero tolerance. So why is
And
the
this-
decrease in zero tolerance that's happening in the status quo not triggering your impacts?
Okay, so the decrease of zero tolerance is happening right now because in like the status quo, there's a push for decriminalization, right? And what we tell you is that by affirming, schools resort on these zero tolerance policies. These zero tolerance policies are the only thing empirically in the past that they have used other than searches under reasonable
It doesn't
suspicion.
answer my question.
Yes, it does, because the deterrent right now is reasonable suspicion. But when they go back to zero tolerance policies, that's how they overcome like the compensation.
Why
I'm
is
gonna ask
this
you a question.
decreasing? Sure.
How much of trust is linked to searches?
We would say a lot, because Foreman
Okay.
says that like criminalization and
How many
increasing
students are
is always problematic.
exposed? How many students are exposed to to searches?
Well, I don't know, I would say a lot. Like,
Okay.
it
And like, are you
probably
saying a
has
lot of
to
like
do with
minority students or like all students in general?
I mean, we would say all students in general, but specifically
Okay.
minority students are more likely to be targeted like 7.7
Yeah.
times according to NAS.
And so you say that by removing probable cause or by implementing probable cause, you increase trust.
Yes.
Does probable cause stop the targeting of minorities?
We don't say that it stops at 100%, there's definitely
Okay.
mitigating.
So
We
does,
never
it,
claim to
does,
get
does
rid of
the
it.
increase in trust apply for those minority students as well?
Yes.
Okay. You believe that?
Yeah.
That minorities who still get searched are going to have more trust in the system.
Wait, we said that like you're decreasing the number of searches on minorities, which affects the minorities that now aren't being
Okay.
searched, and we
So, like,
decrease the
you never
proportion,
changed the
which makes
fact
it seem more.
That they can still target minorities, right?
We
Like,
never
right-
claimed to solve the issues of racism 100%. That's kind of
Right.
what
Like,
ridiculous.
I'm not saying that you can't even solve racism, right? Like,
But
you're
we
trying to say
never said that. We
mitigatory.
just said that we're like mitigating the impact of racism. We would say that that's like ridiculously important. Though.
Yeah, and right now what you're telling me is that we don't stop targeting minority students.
We never solved it.
Are the judges all okay if I sit down? It's hard for me to pull my computer and talk, so I fraction that low.
Yes.
Okay, cool. I'll try to like be loud so everyone can hear me. All right, cool. Start off with an overview to their case. Reasonable suspicion creates an error that students are showing. Sarah Foreman writes in 2011, when the Supreme Court stripped students of the whole protection afforded by the Fourth Amendment, it adopted a narrative of youth criminalization which cast school children as dangerous, out-of-control troublemakers. This perception of kids is a prerequisite to the period of policy they talk about in their case because it's what justifies them in the first place. Jason Nance of the Washington University Law Review writes in 2015 that reasonable suspicion has emboldened school officials to rely on intense surveillance methods to maintain control. Fortunately, Foreman concludes that by instituting probable cause and giving students the same rights as everyone else, we change the way we think about school discipline, which ultimately shapes a better discipline policy in schools. They go to the first contingent about surveillance. 4 problems. The first is that directly, we make most invasive surveillance measures illegal. According to law professor Eve Primus in 2011, when you institute probable cause, it applies to these searches, which would actually make them outlawed because you don't have probable cause to search everyone with a metal detector in the school. But second, according to the National Center for Educational Statistics in 2015, the amount of securitization in schools is only growing right now, so at best they have a marginal impact. But then third, this is really non-unique because their warrant is like deterrence and safety, but schools already want safety at any cost. According to criminologist Eric Mathis in 2015, it's always schools' #1 priority, so any school that thinks something will improve their safety has already done it. But then fourth, the internal link is deterrence, but actually deterrence will go up on that when you make searches more accurate. In fact, Professor Jeff Fagan finds in a study of New York that the areas with a higher percentage of probable cause searches have higher levels of deterrence because they were more accurate searches and therefore had lower levels of crime in the areas with more probable cause searches. But then go on to their second mention about zero tolerance. They say that we're moving away, and this is really true. The key thing to note is that it's because there's a consensus that zero tolerance is bad, so there's no reason we'd flip back. In fact, Ellen Boylan of the Education Law Center in 2012 writes that there's a consensus among education policy experts that there's no reason to accept zero tolerance. But then even the Heritage Foundation, who's pretty conservative, published an article saying that zero tolerance is a bad idea. There's no reason to flip. But then go to their first link. The first link is about the media. 3 problems. The first, that it's non-unique. Charisma of the Independent in 2015 finds there's been a school shooting an average of once a week since Sandy Hook. And since fear-mongering over school shootings will create more fear over safety than probable cause ever could, there's no unique impact. But second, turn it. Because Kimberly Twist of UC Berkeley explained in 2013 that empirically, when courts decide in favor of a policy, there is increased positive media coverage, which means even if the media is now negative now, we can change it because the media respects the courts. But then third, Brian Sellers of the University of South Florida finds in 2013 that zero tolerance policies aren't even driven by the media and weren't implemented during the media moral panic in the 1970s. But then go to their second link about social movements. 2 big problems. The first, that social movements aren't really strong right now. In fact, more and more police are coming in schools, and harsher security continues to increase. This is really important because even if social movements are pushing for zero tolerance, right, other forms of criminalization are going up on that, which leads to my second response, which is that probable cause will actually make movements stronger by legitimizing them at the federal level. In fact, law professor Douglas Shajim, who they are citing, actually confirms empirically that the narrative of important decisions can explain legitimate social change and justify calls for further development because it tells us the message to the public that these social movements are in fact legitimate, causing a nationwide movement. But then go to the last link about deterrence, 4-bit problems. The first of their Aaron part concludes for us. Aaron finds that in schools with more pro-student courts, in areas with more pro-student courts rather, it sends a message that harsh punishments aren't allowed, which actually prompted schools with more pro-student courts to actually get rid of zero tolerance. They're just like misciting this evidence, that's what it concludes. But second, this is totally not unique because what I read you at the top, because schools already want safety at any cost. But then third, the internal link is decreased safety. So again, if we win the safety debate through like criminalizing less students, we're going to win this argument as well. But then fourth and finally, turn it. Because now once we realize that school policies are bad, instead of flipping to zero tolerance, schools flip to restorative justice. In fact, Mail-in Armor of the University of Texas ranked in 2013 that now in response to fear of school safety, schools implement restorative justice because they realize it's much more effective than zero tolerance. This is important because restorative justice is a costly measure, which means it takes actually fears of school safety to prompt schools to have more restorative justice policies. So ultimately, we're going to see a more lenient punishment system when you affirm. That's ultimately going to be better for students and having less zero tolerance policies.
Now, see the part of error that you said.
What?
The part of error that you said.
Yeah, sure. That's fine. I think Richard, yeah. Do you want to see it in the PDF or just like the copy?
Alright, I can see the card there on the side.
Okay. This is like a copy of the card. The PDF is here, so I'm going to do the PDF, but it's totally fine.
And do you think I can see the twist evidence that increase positive media contribution? Yeah. It's too much. I mean, use. Alright. I'm going to be starting on his responses to our case. Is everyone in? The very first thing he tells you at the top is that there's a narrative of school criminalization, but he presents the panacea to the issue as adopting the probable cause standard by the courts. There are three reasons why this doesn't work. First, Kerry Conley of Harvard University tells us that first, once institutionalized, social movements require a higher amount of resources and time to maintain and prioritize the new structures. So what that means is that if you adopt probable cause, that people will view that, they'll be more complacent because they'll view that solving the issue and they don't want to spend more resources on it. But second, realize that once these institutions are created to address a social problem, it becomes hard harder to mobilize the public because A, the movement's own success is stopping the issues which it was built on, and B, even if an issue does arise, they'll just act in place towards it in the future. But third, realize that as social movements increase in efficacy and prominence, so do their counter movements. That counter movement is zero tolerance policies. So right now, in the status quo, in the con world, we have a narrative that's moving away from criminalization of students. But when you affirm, you risk reversing that narrative. You obviously want to prioritize slow, steady change versus the volatile change that would happen if you affirm the resolution. But then really quickly, on the bottom, he reads the twist evidence, saying that there's increased positive media coverage whenever there's a court ruling. That's not what it says. There says it's increased sentiment with the court if the media coverage is in favor of the court's ruling. They never prove to you the media coverage is in favor of the court's ruling. Instead, what we find, especially from Bennett, is that historically it's always going to be negative. But then he tries to respond from Aram by saying that harsh punishments wouldn't increase in schools. But realize that's contingent upon the idea that courts are student friendly. Courts are not student friendly, so at that point he's not gaining access to that. But then let's go over his case. Realize first, before we get into the case, what Daniel Lowson of American University tells us is that only 5% of all suspensions result from drug and weapons offenses. That means for things you can search for, only 5% of those are things you can search for. The other 95% are low-level offenses. So at the end of the day, zero tolerance policies criminalize increasingly that 95%, but they don't, at best, they're only impacting 5%. But then let's go into the first contention about decreased racism. Realize nowhere do they prove to you that the complex of racism in America is caused by significantly by these searches. Rather, there's several other institutionalized factors. But realize that this would increase in an affirmative world. As Jacoby tells us, that as we decrease searches, we decrease the perception of crime control. This leads to two policies trying to be adopted. First is perjury. When police officers search a student, in court later, they just go and they recreate the narrative of probable cause. In fact, what Jacoby finds, she interviews federal judges and prosecutors and finds that 95% of them believe that police lie in court in order to fabricate probable cause. But then, the second thing is aggressive policing. She tells you that when you see a decrease in perception of crime control, you're more likely to increase your police officers will increase their aggressive policing in order to maintain that perception of crime control. So what you're going to see is that although the standard is raised for white students, Black and Latino students just get recriminalized. So that 7.7 times margin that they talk about, that's only getting wider in their world. But let's go to their second contention about individual searches. Right off the bat, their Mylon evidence. Mylon says that although searches may decrease, that increases the perception of crime. That's just more evidence for our zero tolerance policies argument. Then on the school-to-prison pipeline, realize that the school-to-prison pipeline would increase because of an increase in SROs in schools. What Sean Minnow of Houston University tells us is that right now, SROs are very limited. Only 21% of schools have them. But more what Michael Piner of the University of Maryland tells us is that due to the narrow constructs of probable cause, courts would require that law enforcement have to be present and actively involved in a search. That means that any school that ever wants to do a search has to have an SRO on campus. Now, the reason why this becomes harmful is because Jason Nance of the University of Florida tells us is that the result is the hypercriminalization of children, as an SRO increases the odds that a low-level offense is referred to law enforcement by 1.83 times. Again, that's criminalizing that 95% of offenses. At best, they're only impacting that 5% of offenses. Moreover, Heitzig tells you that the most important cause of the school-to-prison pipeline is zero tolerance policies. We're winning there. But then on the idea of trust, realize that in the real world we have probable cause, and yet the police institution is one of those distrusted institutions in the minority community that never proving to you that trust increases. Moreover, they're never proving to you how much searches account for trust. In fact, we would contend that 77% of the school factors that determine trust are non-school specific, according to Dmitry Miley of Ghent University.
Let me see. 21% have SROs. 77% trust is not school specific. And I think that's it.
Okay. Yeah. Do you want to see one more? So,
You can call both actually so you can look at them in your crossfire.
I found you on the computer.
So crossfire? Okay, that's fine.
21%.
So,
Good.
okay, that's fine. can you, like, is
Okay.
it possible for us to like the tiny font, to make the tiny font? So you tell me that SRO is going to need in more searches. Like, why is this?
SRO is going to be one side.
In more searches. Or they're going to need more
Yeah,
searches.
because
You just don't know.
most courts would require
Why?
that under the narrow constructs of probable cause, that SROs be actively involved in the search.
Why?
Let's talk about your
Wait,
second contention.
can I just have like a warrant, not just like a card?
Because the narrow constructs of probable cause. SROs are trained in probable cause.
Okay, so it's
That's
that like,
literally
teachers
your
can't
job.
understand probable cause is the argument?
I mean, it's that most, regardless of whether they can or not, most courts would require it, and most courts is how you grade law. So let's talk about.
So courts under probable cause require, like, so before TLO, SROs are required
Hold
on
on,
every single
before
search.
TLO, there's no definite standard, okay? You're like,
But there was in some
misconstruing
schools,
this.
right?
In some schools,
There was
maybe,
probable cause
but
in
the
some schools.
courts,
Those
but the
schools
courts
did
did
SROs do all
rule,
the
the
searches.
courts did not rule in all schools, or like most courts did not rule
Okay.
that there has to be an SRO present. Let's talk about your second contention about individual searches. So again, like how much does individual searches like account for the school to prison pipeline?
I would say that individual searches are like the prerequisite to being arrested probably in most cases.
Probably
right?
not. Like what if you do an offense that's like a low level offense
Okay.
that doesn't
Even-
require searching? For instance, like if I'm acting out in class,
Fine.
does that require you being?
Like, I don't think that many students get arrested for acting out in class.
Well, however,
I already
most
like the
evidence
majority
tells
of the school to prison pipeline
No.
comes from like drug offenses, which
No,
are
that's
causing
not
searches.
true.
But
Most
even if-
tells us that 95% of like suspension in schools come from low-level offenses. The other 5% are drug and weapon offenses.
That's fine. All right.
That's fine. So you
Sure.
concede to that?
Like that, I'll concede that that card is something we read. That's totally fine. Okay.
All right. That's not what I did read that.
Yes, you did.
I'm not asking you to concede to it.
Okay, so let me ask like what Jake's, the same question that Jake asked just in the first class. Like, if zero tolerance policies are going away,
Yeah.
why isn't the counter movement emerging now?
Because right now, like school officials, they see reasonable suspicion as the linchpin
Okay.
to school
So-
deterrence. So, for instance, what the pain evidence tells us is that 95% of like the school administrators prefer the reasonable admission standard and even think it should be wider.
Totally, like a full-school administrative process. Like, here's my question.
Yeah, it's
So
no,
you
no,
read-
that's
you read
what
the top of the
matters.
case. Yeah, yeah,
Really
okay.
quickly, I'm gonna make a clarification. What school administrators think is what matters because
Sure.
they're the ones that are adopting the zero
totally
tolerance
fine.
policy.
That's totally fine.
All right.
At the top of the case, you read that there are going to be a counter movement that's in favor of zero tolerance. So where is that counter movement in the status quo?
Where is that counter movement in
The one that.
I mean, obviously there are people, but obviously there are people advocating for zero tolerance, but we're telling you that if you remove the linchpin, 95% think it's the linchpin.
So-
you remove that, then
So
you
you're
see this
gonna-
massive like opening of the floodgates.
Okay.
But let's talk about your first contention.
Can we just clarify this real quick?
Yeah.
Like your argument is that whenever you have reform, right, it leads to a counter movement, right? That's what you return on the other argument. Correct?
Yeah,
Okay. So why isn't zero tolerance reform triggering a counter movement of zero tolerance?
it is, but I'm saying it's not as strong because we still have the
So
reasonable
why would
suspicion
probable
standard
cause
in
make it
place.
stronger?
Because 95% consider the reasonable suspicion
So it's
standard.
the administrators from the counter movement? The administrators are going to get us in
No. The reasonable suspicion, they think 95% of administrators think reasonable suspicion is the
I understand,
deterrent.
but you
That's
also
why they
have
don't
evidence.
feel that they need to adopt the zero
Okay.
tolerance policy,
Okay.
even if other people outside of administrators advocate for them.
Yeah, we will start there.
at the top of our case on racism. They gave this like response about aggressive policing, but they never give a warrant for that, right? The warrant that we give report, we're talking about implicit bias, not like actually explicit bias, so this like aggressive policing isn't actually about suggestion at all. But they never warned out, so don't vote on it. Then go to the second contention. They give you this increase in SRO's turns. A couple problems. First of all, like the not part that they're giving about 20%, 21%, is only talking about full-time employees. According to the NCS, 70% of schools have part-time interactions with SROs, which is more important because the link that they're giving is that SROs are only called in for searches, so you should be looking to the part-time data as opposed to the full-time data. Additionally, they're increasing the status quo according to the Chicago Tribune, so there's really no marginal impact. Finally, their link is that you can't like train teachers, and like you need the courts need it because teachers aren't like easy to train, but according to Harvard Law Review, it's super easy to train teachers to do probable cause because it's not that much more complicated than reasonable suspicion, so deal with the SRO argument there. Then finally on trust, the only thing that they say is like how much, like a 77% part. But what this part concedes is that like school factors are important in doing trust. To extent Hirschfeld, this is an individual search that are being most criminalizing because you're pointing out an individual and saying you are a criminal when most of the time they're not. And Foreman says this abuse of authority leads to alienation and an increase in violence and widely quantifies 64% more delinquency. The reason that this outweighs on the scope is because things like zero tolerance only affect the students who are guilty, but there's vastly more innocent students than guilty students, and searches have an even bigger impact on innocent students than zero tolerance would because it's like not relevant to those kids who, as long as they're innocent. Then go to their case. The first thing to extend on the top is premise, which means that surveillance is illegal, right? Under probable cause, because you don't have probable cause to put every single kid through a metal detector. This is hugely important for two reasons. First of all, you can like extend the impact of evade you at the bottom of their first contention from like Nance, and additionally this outweighs on scope because every single kid has to be put through a metal detector, whereas not every kid is subject to zero tolerance. Additionally, it links into zero tolerance policies because kids are like now caught and have more evidence and are now punished under zero tolerance policy if you have securitization, if you have surveillance, but we make that illegal under probable cause. Then go to the media argument. First, extend twist. They say like it's only talking about if the court has like positive coverage, but what twist is saying is that the court shapes the media discourse in positive coverage because the media respects the Supreme Court because it's like a bipartisan group, so they're always positive coverage, which means basically not like dealing there on zero tolerance and like increase the strength of the social movement because now the media is positive.
Can you see twist?
Yeah. Yeah, like the first part is one sided and then later talks about two sided.
Sorry, I just want to see like whatever part you guys.
Yeah, totally. I'm saying, yeah, the part you're reading.
True.
Let's some of the responses that my point made. First, over surveillance. Realize they tell you that these searches are going to be outlawed. Realize that these are not searches, they are surveillance. You do not get banned. They do not have any solvency for this. Then go down onto media discourse. Realize that the only evidence they have of twist is the requirement is that they must receive one-sided media. The problem is that that media is going to be negative, and that only forces the agenda of zero tolerance policies into our schools. But then lastly, they tell you with Aaron, this prompts schools to decrease the number of zero tolerance policies. But that means that there needs to be a court-friendly school. Realize that there are no like court student-friendly courts out there, because right now if they were, then they would be passing this resolution to increase rights. But now you're going to move on to what we say. Right now we say that criminalization is the most important layer of the ground. Let me tell you with Wilson that 95% of all punishments come from non-search related offenses, minor offenses, while the other 5% come from searches. This is important because my opponent's solvency relies on the fact that social movements will corroborate the increase of policies. But Reese gives you 3 responses why their solvency cannot work. First, he tells you that social movements have a trade-off where increase, like over time, they lose resources. And the problem with that is once you affirm, you create a false sense of solvency, and then the movement stops. So the problem is that once you affirm, you increase these counter movements, and those counter movements call for the increase of zero tolerance policies, but they have no opposition. So now, here's the reason why you're going to be voting for us. First, on this topic of escrows. Realize that escrows will be required, and they are full time. The problem is that they criminalize low-level offenses, which are 95% of all punishments, by 1.83 times. And the impact of this isn't the only increase in exactly the problem with the school improvement pipeline, which both teams are trying to impact, and the increased racism as they target minority students. But next, you're going to look at zero tolerance policies. Realize that the loss of deterrence is the most important warrant, because 95% of teachers believe that reasonable suspicion is imperative to safety, and when you implement probable cause, you lose those searches under reasonable suspicion, then you have an increased perception of less crime resolution. This is important because affirming increases rights, and empirically when you increase rights, you increase zero tolerance policies. But they say that the consensus means that these policies won't be adopted. Realize that Aaron tells you it doesn't matter, and Coupe tells you no matter what, these policies will be adopted. At the end of the day, you're winning because they're the #1 cause of the school improvement pipeline. They exacerbate racial differences, and they cause criminalization of all students.
Okay, we have process.
Yeah.
Come here, we will. Alright. Can I ask about your response to the armed evidence, right? So you say that there are no student-friendly courts, right?
Yes.
So how do you make the court like student-friendly? By like having them do a ruling that is in favor of students. The armor evidence.
Those talks are like
That
state courts.
yeah, and also that requires that
Yeah,
being student-friendly,
sure,
that's a student-friendly law, right?
The arm
Also,
evidence that you're
student-friendly
reading.
ruling doesn't make a student-friendly court.
I'm not even trying to turn it. I'm just trying to say that the armor evidence you're reading is saying that when there's more students' rights, there's actually less.
Your arm evidence is saying when there's a student-friendly court, meaning there has to be a history of student-friendly rulings.
So
then
more
there-
student-friendly rulings means.
I mean, just because, like, one data point does not make a trend. Just because you pass
Yeah,
law-
RM says that there's a trend. There's more student-friendly courts. There's less punitive policies.
Problem
Like
is
if we
there are no
increase the
student-friendly
amount of
courts.
student-friendly courts,
Yeah,
we're not trying to make it a term. We're just trying to say that RM
We
is
say that
not
we
relevant
wouldn't
to your
use
side.
it as
It's
a
like if
student-friendly
anything, it's for our side. We're not going to go for that
Yeah,
offense, but it just
student-friendly
terminal to your
courts, there's
contention
not
because that's the part you extend.
That's the problem. You don't provide any like reasonable warrant about to why this number of students.
Again,
courts-
it's not. We're not going for province on our side. I'm just trying to say that your card doesn't include for you, so you can't extend that as offense.
You would contend that there would be a decrease in student-friendly courts, because at the end of the day, you're only stifling social movements.
But the warrant for that is the RM part.
Because if there are no social movements, there's no one activating for, acting for change in the courts.
Okay, so you said that no student-friendly courts exist, so how have social movements been effective in making student-friendly courts
At
right
the
now?
law level, like at 38 states are repealing zero tolerance policies. That's like independent of the judicial level. When we
Okay,
tell you,
so
when you try to
then,
make
so
such
then
a drastic.
student-friendly courts
Hold on.
do exist.
No.
Because it's not the courts that are making.
Yeah, the law, the
So
things
then
right now
what
that
is,
are
so then what does
happening-
social movements have to do with courts?
Here's our narrative, right? So in the status quo, 38 states are repealing zero tolerance policies. That's happening on a legislative level. Now, what Payne finds is that 95% of teachers and administrators believe that it's like reasonable suspicion is the linchpin to deterrence. So when you take, make a student-friendly court or whatever, like when you affirm the resolution and you completely like remove this deterrence, they have to compensate, they have to fill that back into some sort of
That's the
way.
Coupe evidence, right?
No, that's, well,
Like the
95%
Coupe evidence, not,
95%.
but your
That's
link,
also
your link for
error
deterrence
and
is Coupe, right? Which is,
Aaron and Coupe.
okay, well, not has the index of error, and Coupe is talking before the
I mean, we just
consensus, right?
responded to the student-friendly court.
I'm just saying that the RM part does not conclude for you guys. It
The
says
RM part
that
does
student-friendly
say
courts are a good thing.
No, the air.
Probable cause is more student-friendly. This is silly, but let's
The
move
error
on.
part-
Let's talk about like the social movements.
Yeah, please don't misconstrue evidence. The air part.
I showed you
that
the file.
that empirically, when you increase student rights, you decrease the amount of policies that actually support students. You increase punitive
I'm
policies.
saying that it literally says the opposite, and any of the judges are welcome to call
Yeah,
for the
and like that's empiric, so like that happens.
I'm
before
saying
it's
the
when
empiric goes in the
it's-
other direction.
Okay,
According to the
so-
card, clearly we're not getting anywhere on this card,
Yeah.
but I just encourage those to call for the evidence because it concludes for us. That's fine. Do you guys like a question? Last
I mean,
10
like, we
seconds?
have policies.
Okay, cool.
Has been.
We'll take 45 seconds.
Don't answer the question.
Yeah. Everyone ready? Cool. Alright. Start briefly on both pitch ones fault. The first is the SRO argument. The two things that they drop. The first they don't drop from Jake that the SROs according to Sherman Tribunal increasing the status quo, which means at best they act as a marginal impact because there's already more and more SROs. But second, they don't really respond to Jake's announcement on their link, which is that probable cause is really easy to tame teachers. They just assert that SROs are going to have to do the searches, but they don't give a warrant, and our argument is that probable cause isn't that much more complicated, so there's no need for more SROs. Then also on their zero tolerance argument, the real big thing that they drop is the boiling card from 2012 that says there's a consensus that zero tolerance is bad, which means they'll never turn back to it, and the armor evidence says that now in school spirit of safety, they turn to restorative justice instead of zero tolerance. This is terminal to the contention because they never respond to it, and their cards all come from like the early 2000s when we actually thought zero tolerance was a decent idea. But then go to the reasons you're voting for us. The first is that we're going to have a decrease in individual searches. They basically believe that searches are going to go down, and they try to outweigh. But they outweigh by saying that like punishment doesn't come from like searches most of the time. But our argument is that we're not even impacting punishment, we're impacting decriminalizing more students because you can search innocent students, and most of the time they're searching innocent students under reasonable suspicion. This is really important because it outweighs on scope because of the analysis Jake gives that goes unresponded to that says that there are more innocent students than guilty ones. This also links into SRO or the zero tolerance policies and SROs because when you have more crime, when you criminalize students, according to the Wiley evidence, after you've been searched, you're 64% more likely to commit delinquency, then there's going to be more violence in schools, which is going to lead to more zero tolerance policies and more harsh discipline. But then go to the second reason you're voting for us, which is very similar. It's on the surveillance argument, right? They argue that like surveillance is not the same thing as a search. We're telling you that metal detectors and drug dogs and all those general searches are types of searches. That's the previous evidence that they're very explicit on, which means those would be outlawed. This is really important for two reasons. The first is you can extend all their impacts about those things leading to more violence. This is important because it also turns zero tolerance policies and SROs, as I talked about before, because when you have more violence, you have more justification for those. But second, it again outweighs zero tolerance policies on scope, because zero tolerance policies can only impact the people who are getting punished and arrested, but I'm telling you that this will impact every single student, every single day, every time they walk through the school door, which is going to be really problematic when you're increasing crime on net and increasing the justification for more harsh discipline in the future.
Alright, is everyone ready? Are we starting on SROs? Starting on SROs, realize the pioneer evidence is very clear in telling us that most courts would require, because of their narrow constructs, that SROs have to be the ones initiating and conducting the searches. That means that even if teachers can be trained to conduct probable cause searches, it doesn't matter insofar as the courts want SROs to be the ones conducting the searches. Moreover, it tells you that their SROs are increasing right now. We tell you that right now full-time SROs are at 20%. That would jump to 100% because any school that ever wants to ever do a search has to have an SRO present. But moreover, they tell you that we don't give a warrant as to why like SROs would increase. Realize it's that the courts would require them. They're never responding to that. Nance tells you it increases the likelihood that low-level offenses are referred to law enforcement by 1.83 times. At best, they're only impacting the 5% that Lowson talks about that can be affected by searches. We're impacting the 95%. You increase criminalization of those 95% of offenses that are very low level. But second, let's talk about changing the narrative. Realize that the narrative that they're talking about is happening right now, and it's happening in slow and gradual change. The ACS tells you that on the legislative level, 38 states are removing zero tolerance policies. But moreover, realize that when you affirm the resolution and pass probable cause, that just increases the radicality of these movements. And rather, what the Congolese evidence finds is that when you like legitimize them and you portray probable cause as the solution to these movements, you lose resources for this funding, so you can no longer decriminalize students, and moreover, you create more counter movements. So when you take this radical change that my opponents propose, you just create more counter movements. That counter movement is the idea of zero tolerance policies. Realize that zero tolerance policies aren't really creating a decrease in increasing the perception of crime right now because of the reasonable suspicion standard in place. Payne tells you that 95% of teachers support this standard and they believe it is the linchpin to safety. But if you remove that standard, you create a vacuum in which people need to securitize. The first and overwhelming knee-jerk thing they turn to is zero tolerance policies. And Heitzig explains they're the #1 facilitator of the school-to-prison pipeline. So by affirming, you're just creating more counter movements, you're increasing the criminalization of students, and I can see nothing but a negative ballot.